We're going to take some questions. Calm down. And please, be concise, short questions, so that as many people can make questions as they want. So let's start here. Flavio, I'll get to you. Please identify yourself shortly and make a concise question. Going to take a bunch of questions, sure. Right? Yeah. All right.
Bom dia, meu nome é Rafael Almeida. Oh, sorry, my name is Rafael Almeida, and I'd like to know what is the role of, if any, of Russian tactical nuclear weapons to its foreign policy, and what do you perceive about if do you perceive there is any conflict of interest between BRICS, IBAS, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Thank you very much.
Okay. Go. Next one. Okay. Flávio, já chega você aqui.
Ok. Meu nome é Jorge Romano, da Universidade Federal do BC. My name is Jorge Romano from the University of ABC. No, I was a little bit puzzled at the end when you say that Russia doesn't have a strategic approach. I mean, if we look at the world, the confusion of Trump and goes one way and the other, it's often said that Putin, whatever you think about him, is a major, has a strategic view. So I was a little bit puzzled. And what would then be? You said, I hope that Russia will have a strategic view. What would this mean?
Okay. Flávio.
Is right. Okay, my name is Flávio Bittelman. I'm the consul of Moldova, honorary in Brazil. And my question is regarding Russia, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, in this issue, how Russia is going to play their role.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Can we take another one? Okay. Depois eu trago.
Thanks. My name is Sergio. Can you talk about the Alexander Dugin influence over Putin's court?
Okay. Atrás de você aqui.
Good morning. My name is Gustavo. I am a graduate student on international relations, and I research Russia's relations with Serbia. And my question is regarding the situation in the Balkans. I'll try to be as fast as possible. It's widely accepted that the Balkans do not come into Russia's so-called sphere of privileged interests, but it came to be seen as a potential arena of confrontation since the Ukraine crisis, at least in the West. Analysts tend to see it this way. So my question is, do you think it can actually become an arena of confrontation? Can Russia back its rhetoric in the region by concrete acts? It seems unlikely to me, but having in mind that virtually the whole of the region has been absorbed into NATO, but a few years ago, few people would imagine that Russia would restore its status in the Middle East. You yourself wrote that Russia virtually left the region after the Cold War, so how do you see the situation? Thank you very much.
Can we go on collecting questions?
Or
would
you're
rather-
the czar here.
No, but you are the one on the tight
I'm
spot.
not.
So
I'm fine.
you're fine. So vamos pegar mais uma. Espera um pouquinho. Calma, Eduardo. Calma lá. Eduardo Greif aqui. Eduardo Greif aqui.
My name is Eduardo. I took that Russian people situation is improving despite what you called economic underperformance. Could you elaborate a bit? And could you compare Russia and China's paths from this point of view?
Threats, Russia's and China's threats?
Paths.
Oh, paths.
Trajectories.
Okay. Right, okay.
Uma lá atrás. Eduardo, desde que seja breve.
My name is Eduardo Dares. I'm the founder of an association which aims to providing freely and safely place for human beings to walk in public places. It's a very ambitious.
And your question is?
My question is, what do you think about the United Nations? You talked about NATO, you talk about all kind of strategic positions which should be achieved. The United Nations is a dreaming organization.
Okay, back to the United Nations is useless.
Your consideration about the United Nations.
Okay, all right.
It's a dreaming organization.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, thank you.
But just what the lady there with. Okay, last question.
Good morning. I would like to thank you for your exposition, and I would like to know your position about Israel and the Jews, considering that Russia has an opposite position with the United States. So how they see Israel and Palestine, according to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Tactical nukes. That issue, the issue of tactical nuclear weapons, has been on the back burner for a very long time. Tactical nukes are essentially about warfighting. They're not about deterrence. However, in the wider scheme of deterrence, they also play a role. The idea being that, again, we are in this esoteric world of nuclear theology, but the idea being if your only choice is between suffering a defeat at the hands of a conventionally more powerful enemy or ending the world, you would rather not end the world. So you would have all your strategic nuclear arsenals, and yet you will suffer a defeat on the battlefield, and you will not use that major asset that you have, because that will be essentially suicide. So the nuclear theology has always postulated that you, in order to be credible, you need to have something in between, something that would be nuclear, i.e. extremely, that will be crossing a certain line that would be a step toward nuclear holocaust, nuclear self-annihilation, and yet it would allow you to come back after your enemy will have seen the dangers of preceding the war with you that he was winning. In the days of the Cold War, when I served in Germany, the Soviet Union was credited, in East Germany, the Soviet Union was credited with massive conventional superiority over NATO forces in Europe. And the West, in order to keep the Soviet Union at bay, had a number of tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe. And basically, the idea was that once the Soviet Union invades Western Europe, there will be a signal to the Soviets to stop. And that signal will be employment of tactical nukes. Now, Russia today is the weaker party vis-a-vis the United States, much weaker party. And I think in a way it has adopted an approach that is broadly similar to the one that NATO used during the Cold War. And the Russian military doctrine basically says that if we are losing on the battlefield in a conventional war, and the existence of the Russian Federation is at stake, then we'll go nuclear. And that phrase does not mean that we will go nuclear all way, because it makes no sense. If we go nuclear by using the entire arsenal, nothing will be left of the world. So that means that there is a place for tactical nuclear weapons. I hope it remains a theology. I hope it's never put to practice, but that is the place of tactical nuclear weapons in Russian foreign policy. Is there a conflict between BRICS and the SCO? Not necessarily. The SCO includes 3 of the countries that are parts of BRICS. They include China, India, and Russia. So to me, again, in a more strategically guided foreign policy by Russia, BRICS would be a global collective instrument of changing the world order, or let's say making the world order less Western-centered, whereas the SCO is more of a security and development arrangement for Eurasia, where neither Brazil nor South Africa are situated. So that would be my answer. But my criticism is that it's both BRICS and to some degree the SCO are yet to find their actual role in international relations. They are more, both of them are more promises than realities. Well, again, I was talking about Russia's foreign policy, so this is not, it's not Russia. IBSA is very, I think it's very interesting. I would say that this would be, to me, again, off the top of my head, in the larger scheme of things, IBSA would be an equivalent of the SCO. It's a group of major countries in the southern hemisphere that have some overlapping interests that can collaborate for the common good, promotion of their interests and all that. So that would be, so if you have IBSA, that's fine. I think that goes in the direction of a more balanced world. I would not, I think that the idea that the Russians and the Chinese have been pushing for the last 20 plus years of multipolarity is wrongly defined. I don't think that I don't think multipolar exists or can exist in a physical world, and we still live in a physical world. But I think we need all of us need a balanced world, more equilibrium in the world. And the world is, within our own countries and globally, the world is very much disequilibrated, right? So there's no equilibrium. And I think that the right strategy's goal would be more equilibrium to the world, and IBSA would provide that equilibrium, in my view. Is Putin a strategist or not? Let me give you one example. I think my strongest criticism of Mr. Putin's policies on Ukraine is certainly not Crimea. It's not even Donbass, although I think it was a big mistake in many ways. But prior to the Ukraine crisis, Russia's policy toward Ukraine in the years preceding the crisis was so bad that its defeat was better, certainly would have cost us, actually did cost us less than its success would have cost us. Suppose Mr. Putin's policies with Ukraine had worked, and Ukraine had been made member of the Eurasian Economic Union. Ukraine would have become a big black hole for Russian resources, would have to keep it afloat, a country with a much lower level of standard of living for a very long time. we would have to make, we would have made Ukraine blackmail us every step of the way in the Eurasian Union councils. They would have sold us every agreement to any Russian proposal very dearly. And at the end of the day, they would have reversed themselves and they would march to the west, because the bulk of the Ukrainian elite is, whether it's east, west, south, or center, is devoted to the Ukrainian national project, which is essentially anti-Russian. And what we have now is very bad for many reasons, but at least it's not as bad as it would have been. Russia is not Ukraine is no longer our problem; it's somebody else's problem, and we're better off now with the policies having failed than we would have been if the policies had succeeded. Putin was also saying many times that confrontation with the United States will not be permitted. And yet he failed, I think, to see the trends and adapt to those trends that led us to that confrontation. I would also say that he's trying to get something from the United States that the United States will never give. He wants to be understood. He spends a lot of time talking to American journalists and all that about the need to understand Russia. I think that is a waste of time. And very importantly, I think we have not yet started seriously developing a long-term strategy with regard to the most important partner or neighbor that we have in Eurasia, and that's China. We have, as I said, we have a good relationship, but if you look ahead, 10, 20, 30 years ahead, you need to have a better strategy, a better goal, and a clearly identified goal and a better strategy of getting to that goal. So again, I don't think that it was very strategic. There are also questions about the Middle East. I don't think that the Middle East, the operation in Syria was strategic at some level. It was strategic up to the level that was reached at the end of last year. A military defeat of the forces opposed, of the bulk of the forces opposed to Damascus. Yes, that was achieved in a glaring success by the Russian military. But beyond that, do we have a strategy now? Mr. Putin said early on at the beginning of the operation that we will come there we will go to Syria for a period of time. Mission accomplished, we'll pull back. Mission was accomplished. We're not getting back. We will not be able to extricate ourselves from Syria without a very serious loss of face in that part of the world, which we don't want. So we had a military strategy, we didn't have a political strategy. And now we have to deal with that issue. Again, everyone has his or her limitations. I think that Mr. Putin is exceptionally good at tactical things, at operational things. Crimea was a brilliant example of that, but already Donbass was a huge failure for the lack of thinking, lack of preparation, faulty analysis, letting things happen, letting people do things. That is all non-strategic to me.
Why do you think Crimea is an example of Putin's brilliant tactical genius?
Well, if anyone would have told me in 2013, let's say, that the Russian army would be able to take control of Crimea without firing a shot and killing a single person, I would have said, this is totally fairy tale. Yet they managed to do that. They managed to connect with the bulk of the population who were pro-Russian. They managed to prevent bloodshed, which was only very possible in Crimea. They managed to, I think, through efforts that have been in place way before the crisis, they managed to infiltrate, I think, the Ukrainian forces in Crimea with their own sympathizers, so that the Ukrainian commanders would not give, the Ukrainian commanders in Crimea would not give an order to shoot at the Russians. Again, from the technical point of view, that was certainly a big coup, brilliantly executed. But again, this was not part of a wider strategic thinking. For example, Mr. Putin is now saying, most recently in his State of the Nation address of March 1, that the enlargement of NATO and American, U.S. Efforts to build ballistic missile defenses were no big problems for Russian security. He's saying that they can not make more than a dent in the Russian security system. Why then was all this opposition to NATO membership? The two bad things about NATO membership, NATO enlargement. One was the actual process of NATO enlargement, all the way, non-strategic from the Western standpoint, all the way to the Russian border. And the other mistake by the Russians of taking it so seriously and fighting it so seriously. Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO today, but it's a country that is an adversary, sees Russia as an adversary, an enemy even, and that will be the case for years to come. So they are not in NATO, but they can they host U.S. bases in their territory? Yes, they can. They cannot host them to Crimea, but they can host the U.S. Navy in Odessa. They, what's the gain? They're not in NATO, but what's the gain? They can do all the things and even more of the things that would be problematic to Russia outside of NATO. So this whole business of, making NATO enlargement more than it actually was, and making ballistic missile defenses seem more dangerous than they actually were, that I think was strategic. From the strategic standpoint, those were very, very wrong things. So that would be my answer to that. Russia, as I said, does not have allies in the sense of the United States or the Soviet Union, but it has alignments. You mentioned the Russia, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah alignment. It works. It is more of a kind of alignments that existed in Europe in the 18th century. So you're my ally for this campaign, but in the next campaign you may be my adversary, and I will do. That's shifting alliances. That's what it is. So far, it's been fairly productive from the Russian standpoint, but it's not a strategic alignment. You talked about Russia, Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Turkey is also part of that alignment from the Russian perspective. Russia is with Iran on some issues. It's not with Iran on other issues. Russia is a country in the Middle East that straddles so many divides that a lot of people thought would be impossible. Tomorrow, on Russia's most sacred holiday, May 9, Victory Day over Nazi Germany, the Israeli Prime Minister is visiting Moscow to talk about Iran. President Trump will, or maybe he has already announced his stance on the Iran, on the JCPOA, the agreement on the Iranian nuclear issue. But the Israeli Prime Minister is coming to Moscow. And the Russians and the Israelis, and I'm really answering this question about Russia and Israel, the Russians and the Israelis may disagree about things, but they speak the same language, the language of, call it realpolitik, call it pragmatism, call it whatever. Russia and Iran disagree about where Iran stands with regard to acquisition of a nuclear weapon capability. But Russia was sending dozens of its experts to Israel to talk through all the issues related to the Iranian nuclear program with Israeli officials from military circles, from intelligence circles. It's a very close relationship in many ways, and yet it's not an alliance relationship. The alliance is with Iran. Alignment, let's say, is with Iran. So it's Middle Eastern geopolitics in a very real way. Russia does not regard anyone as a 100% ally, nor does it regard anyone as a 100% adversary. That's how it manages things. It deals with Hezbollah and it deals with Israel. It deals with Hamas and it deals with Israel. It deals with Saudi Arabia, it deals with Iran. There are very few countries who can do all those things at the same time. Russia can. So this is a badge of distinction, at least for the Russian diplomatic corps. But again, you would need something more that does not come from diplomats. It should come from a higher level, and that is a strategy. I'm not sure we have a strategy in the Middle East. We're tactically very capable. Strategically, in my view, not so. Mr. Dugin's influence is overrated. Vastly overrated. I think he played a role, a very visible role in the 1990s when the central, when mainstream was about Western integration, about the new world, geopolitics being out of the window. We're now in a win-win situation where we're all globalists. You know, we all love one another, and the United States is a big, good, and trusted friend. And he was saying something very different. I don't think that he is. He did enjoy some support from the Kremlin, as I understand, for a period of time. But I don't think that he is someone who impacts on Putin's thinking, or did impact on Putin's thinking in the last few years. I think Putin was certainly changed many things in his way of thinking when he was prime minister. I think he became close to quite a few people, quite a few clerics of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there's something that he said in one of his recent interviews with North Americans, in your view, of all people, when he said that he quoted somebody. He did not mention his own view of that quote, but the way that the fact that he quoted it, I think, is very telling. He said something like this: "Russia is the only. We all exist under God," he said, "but Russia is the only country in the world that is actually directly led by God." I have no comment on that. The Balkans. I think there's a little bit of an exaggeration in the Western mind today of the Russian role in the Balkans. If you go to the Balkans, a lot of local politicians actually exploit the Russia factor. There's a lot of sympathies traditionally in that part of the world for Russia. If you look at the flags of Slovenia and Serbia and even Slovakia, they are versions of the Russian flag, and that is not this does not happen by chance. But I wouldn't exaggerate that very much. if you go to the Balkans, the local politicians are perhaps the most cynical politicians anywhere in the world. And this is a difficult competition,
Yeah.
clearly. But these guys are really something. Russia's influence is small, but I think a few Russian, what happened under Putin III, if you like, the previous presidency, is that he allowed a few more actors to step onto the foreign policy turf. He mentioned, what was the phrase, patriotic hackers, right? There are also freelancers who, former military intelligence people and others who I think, like, some of them, even though they may be generals or retired generals, some of them have remained kids at heart. So they went on a trek to the Balkans to, to do something. Nothing very serious in my view, nothing very strategic, and nothing would have come out of it. But they did their bit. I think the West is now seeking to enhance, Western elites, in other words, are seeking to enhance their awareness of Russia, awareness of the Russian threat, and they are overdoing it on purpose, so as to mobilize people, which is very pragmatic, so as to mobilize other countries against that Russia threat. The Skripal case, I think, falls into the same category. Is the Russia, can the Balkans become an area of conflict? Yes, mostly domestic conflict, because I think that there are many issues beneath the surface in the Balkans that are not given proper attention. There's a lot of extremism. There's a lot of potential terrorism potential in the Middle East. Russia, to me, is not, whether Russia will get involved if something like that happens, cannot rule that out, but it would be foolish to do that. Russia, by the way, I think has learned some of the lessons in Ukraine. If you watched Russia's attitudes to the recent developments in Armenia and the emergence of a new prime minister, new top man in Armenia, from the leader of the opposition to the prime minister, you will see that Russia acted very, very differently from the way it acted in Ukraine. And that, I think, is a good thing. So I hope that this more adult attitude also prevails in the Balkans. Serbia is focused on its EU membership, potentially NATO membership. I don't think that Russia has much influence there. Rhetoric is one thing, reality is another thing. Is the Russian people's situation improving? I talked about the bigger picture. If you focus on the last several years, the situation has been getting worse. In the last maybe 10 years, Russia reached its apex in its economic growth in 2008, and since then it has been essentially going down. Its growth rate now is anemic. It's between 1% and 2%, closer to 1 than to 2. I don't think there's a chance under the present socio-economic and political economic system. I don't think there's a chance of doing much better. But again, all that said, it is incomparable to the situation in the 1990s, where for a lot of people it was about survival. The situation in the 1980s, where for a lot of people it was about food shortages and other such like things. And the 1970s were the top period of the communist era, but then people, of course, were very unfree in many ways. In the 1960s, they only started to breathe more or less normally after the period of the wars and then Stalinism. And if we go to Stalin and the wars and the collectivization, which was essentially elimination of physical elimination of a lot of peasants and then physical elimination of a lot of bourgeoisie that they were called. You know, you have to compare it with something. And in the Russian context, this last 18-year period has been nothing but a gift from God, if you like.
A direct gift from God.
Exactly. Russia's and China's paths are vastly different cultures, different civilizations, and all that. Russia could have started on what has become China's path at the latest, maybe in the mid-1950s, right after Stalin's death. So there was still enthusiasm. But I'm talking only in a notional way. Politically, there were really no possibilities for that. Or better still, in the 1920s, when instead of doing what what the Bolsheviks under Stalin decided to do, they could have begun a policy of self-enrichment with a focus on agriculture. But then, I don't know whether Russia would have been able to survive in the Second World War had it not been for Stalin's policy of industrialization. So there are always trade-offs. United Nations. Let me be very cynical about the United Nations, or rather about Russia, not so much about the United Nations as about Russia. Russia loves the United Nations for one thing, and one thing only, and I'm sure you know that thing. It's called veto right at the UN Security Council, which means that things can be done against the Russian interest, but you can always say that those things were illegitimate, according to international law. And that is the attitude. And I think I've already spoken about Israel and Russia. I will only add that in that part of the world, Israel is physically, emotionally, perhaps the closest country to Russia. You come to Israel, you hear the language spoken, you have any number of your former compatriots who speak Russian the way you speak it. You have Russian newspapers, you have Russian television station, Russian theaters, you have everything. And you feel for them. And they, having been your compatriots only 20 or 30 years ago, they also feel for you. So it's a close relationship in that sense. Nothing to be compared with the relationship with the Palestinians, who are still somewhat more distant people. Russia's foreign policy tries to keep certain balance between Israel and the Palestinians. More successful than unsuccessful, but again, Russia doesn't have much to give, frankly, to the Palestinians these days. So it's an interesting relationship in the sense that Israel is a staunch ally of the United States, and yet it cherishes its relationship with Russia. You know what? When the issue of Crimea was put to the vote in the United Nations at the General Assembly, unfortunately for Russia, and countries were making their views known and public about their attitudes to Russia's actions in Crimea, Israel was not there. So the Israeli delegate did not show up. There was a fine pretext for that. On that day, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it happens in that country, went on strike. So much for that relationship. Thank you.
So before we close, I will abuse the condition of being chairing the session, and nobody mentioned the Russian interference in electoral processes abroad. How serious was that? Was just a bunch of lunatics unleashed by the Kremlin, or the Kremlin was behind it? If the Kremlin was behind it, was it a tactical move? And what are the consequences? And
Sergio, I think I mentioned patriotic hackers, and that
Yeah,
is-
very slightly.
yes, I'm certainly glad to talk about that. I don't know.
Okay.
I
I wouldn't tell anyway.
I could imagine things. So I could imagine a scene in Mr. Putin's office somewhere around 2012 when he came back to the Kremlin. And he just experienced major demonstrations in the city of Moscow that grew from 5,000 to 200,000 within weeks. A lot of people around Mr. Putin were terrified that something like a color revolution was coming to Moscow. Mr. Putin publicly blamed Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at that time, for interference in Russian affairs because she was supportive of the outburst of democratic activity in Russia. And he even accused the United States of having paid some of the demonstrators. Then there was a major rally outside the Kremlin on the eve of the inauguration day, which again, as this year was May 7, it was on May 6 that this happened. And it was the first time that one of those big demonstrations ended in some violence. There was blood spilled. No one was killed, but a few people were injured. And that happened just across the Moscow River from the Kremlin. It was very, very serious. And that pushed Mr. Putin toward what I call the policy of sovereignization. He booted out, tried to expunge foreign interference from the Russian political world. A few NGOs who had foreign funding had to declare that they were foreign funded and they were branded foreign agents and all that. A lot of things happened. So I could imagine Mr. Putin in 2012 talking to his propaganda people and others who would be relevant to that and telling them something like this. Why is this that we're always on the defensive? Why is it that when an American dignitary comes to our beloved city of Moscow, one of the things that he or she does would be convening a bunch of liberal opposition figures in Spaso House, the residence of the American ambassador in Moscow, and give them instructions about how to fight the constitutionally elected government of Russia? Why is it that they can do these things and we cannot? They also fund so many pro-democracy organizations who are doing what they're doing and, fund various websites and, in the interest of time, I will stop here. Why aren't we doing anything of the kind? Are these guys saints? Do they have no skeletons in their cupboards? Why should we be standing still, even though they are obviously attacking us with the aim, stated or unstated, of undermining and then toppling our system? Why can't we fight back and push back? And then you may have seen the change in the way that Russia Today, RT, started to focus on the United States and the Western world. Basically, they adopted the former model of Western propaganda beamed at the Soviet Union. You single out issues that are not talked about in the Soviet Union. You give airtime to voices that are not heard in the Soviet Union, and you just you push that to the Soviets. In the same way, they focus on issues now that mainstream media does not find interesting. what happened after the end of after the end of Soviet communism was this mainstreamization, if you like, of many things in Western countries, in the United States and in Europe. Everyone is more or less in the center. The flanks are not covered. So Russian propaganda went into the flanks and started giving airtime to the voices that would not be invited to the talk shows on American television networks, and giving, all these things. I can also imagine, since Russia has a certain number of highly qualified cyber people, I would imagine Mr. Putin saying, or somebody on his behalf saying, well, guys, you can go into the open, do things. If you find something interesting, please share it with us. We might find some use for it. Because in this Mr. Putin, since late February 2014, has been a wartime president. And no holds are barred in a war, just like in love. And from his perspective, it's perfectly okay to do something to them to fight what they're doing to you. So my thinking was this: the serious people were doing, serious hackers were doing serious things. In other words, trying to get real secrets from the CIA, from the White House, from the Pentagon, so that would be the business of serious people. The volunteers would be allowed to go to the Democratic National Committee or Podesta's private email, soft targets of no particular significance to Russian national security. But if they hold something back, remember, this is all pure fiction. This is my imagination. You do all these things, and if you're successful, then okay, we can use that. And why not? They are using stuff against us. Why can't we use it? If they can use, again, from Mr. Putin's perspective, what was done to the Russian Olympic team under the so-called doping scandal was a special operation by the United States and other allied special services. The publication of the Panama Papers is another thing. So if you can do that, we can do this, all right? And but as I said, it was non-strategic. In my view, there was never any hope or any idea of making Donald Trump the president of the United States. A, they never took Trump very seriously. B, they never thought that he would win. Russian television on the eve of the American election was essentially making it all clear that the next president of the United States was going to be Hillary Clinton. And that was the position taken by Russian state-owned television channels. Trump was being used as a figure that sort of discredited the American political system. The idea was to discredit that.
It certainly does. Yeah.
Yes, you're discrediting our sacred role in the Second World War. You're telling the world that what we did in Eastern Europe was another occupation, that we're on a par with Hitler, essentially. Okay, and this is the basic, one of the basic foundations of contemporary Russian identity. It hits us very hard when, as today, or was it yesterday, one of the Russian generals and marshals' statues in Prague was desecrated again. It doesn't feel good, especially when you paid hundreds of thousands of lives of your soldiers for the liberation of a Poland or a Czechoslovakia or anything. So it hits us hard. The West doesn't care about these things. They don't. They would rather support those who fought against the Soviets, i.e. with the Nazis in the Second World War, than the Soviets. So if you hit us hard, we'll hit you hard. Your most important feature of self-identity is what? Democracy? Okay. We will tell the world what your democracy really is. So that's a hardball that they're playing. I think that the Russians did interfere, and I think it was done with Mr. Putin's guidance. My problem again with that, and with many other things, is that it was non-strategic. So what's the you can have good time, you know, looking at some of the things that the DNC was doing against somebody, but it's short-lived. That's the problem.
I was about to close, but Lenina asked me to make one last short question, and since is Lenina and no one else, I would allow you to do so.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you to appreciate what the economic sanctions are doing to economic development of Russia. When you answer the question, someone asked you if the people, Russian people, was living better. Well, it was not said that during a lot of time, Russia has been sanctioned and had to adapt its economic development to these sanctions. And I would add one thing more. Something has to do with the relations Russia establishes with other countries, the politics to maintain the level of international prices on energy, oil and gas, especially oil, with the Arab countries. Would you mind to comment, please?
I'll do that briefly. As I said, the worst thing about the sanctions is not the sanctions themselves, but rather the message that they carry. The message that they carry can be is a poisonous message, and the worst result of that message is that technological development of Russia is being retarded because of the sanctions. Not because of the sanctions themselves, but because of the wider implications of those sanctions. These sanctions have also pushed the Russian government to come up with counter-sanctions, such as not allowing European food products to reach Russia, except for some. And that led to, that's a help to the Russian agricultural sector, but the sector has some time to develop to the appreciable standard, and then the prices went up. So it was one of the, I don't think it was a prime reason for Russia's drop in living standards over the last 10 years, but it certainly contributed to that. On the other hand, the issue of oil is playing a different role, and Russia, through its relations with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries, has been able to keep oil at a certain price level. Today it's reached 76, which is very, very high from, if you look at from the vantage point of 29 that it reached at some point in 2014-15. So there are two sides to all that. But to me, the worst thing about the sanctions is the technological blockade. Again, it's not something new. The Soviet Union was under technological blockade for decades from the United States. And then even after the end of the Cold War, Russia was not allowed to import some of the advanced technologies from the West, even though we were formerly partners and even allies in some way. but again, the issue is not the sanctions. To me, the issue of Russia's economic development is not the sanctions, not even the technological effect that they're having. The issue is the political economic system that stifles, that is over-monopolized, that stifles competition, that is very corrupt, that allows, well, I don't have to tell all these things to you. You know them perfectly well. It's that. Sanctions contribute significantly, but the bulk of the economic problems come from Russia itself.
I think you deserve another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.